The last 3 years have given you a lot of reasons not to be here today. Yet, here you are, resolute and unyielding in the face of an impossible challenge to save humanity from itself. And at some point, you must have asked yourself, why? Why bother? Why try? Why fight? Who died and put you in charge of solving one of the greatest crises in human history? Why don't you just go home, pull together what assets you can, and try to adapt faster than your neighbors? At some point, you've considered this path. You've longed to blissfully follow the crowd, but you can't. Some inexplicable loyalty to humanity compels you to keep trying, struggling, and believing. You see a world that needs saving, and you can't turn away. Short and simple, you're one of the good ones, one of the best. And today, after 3 long years, you are finally back with your people. You're standing elbow to elbow with the best humans the earth has to offer. You are not alone in your stand for a livable world. So look around and soak in the next precious hours with your fellow unsung heroes. Be rejuvenated by them, bask in each other's glow, and then go change the world. You are Citizens Climate Lobby, and you are humanity's best hope.
Please welcome Zaurie Zimmerman.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay. Welcome. Thank you so much. I really didn't expect that. Thank you for being humanity's best hope and for being here today in person and online. One person I had really hoped would be here standing next to me was Dr. DeJarnett, who unfortunately an uninvited virus interfered, but she sends her regards from quarantine. And if you don't know her, please get to know her. You can follow her on YouTube and Twitter and LinkedIn. You don't miss her. Dr. DeJarnett works at the intersection of public health, environmental health, climate change health, and social justice. She joined the board with interest to bring the public health and health equity voice into the climate conversation. She couldn't be more grateful to the board, the staff, and our incredible volunteers for the opportunity to serve such a great mission, much larger than herself. Nor can I. It's a great honor. Natasha is an American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists board-certified environmental scientist and researcher, scholar, and professor. She's president-elect of the Board of Physicians for Social Responsibility. She's president-elect of the board, a member of the EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, the environmental section chair-elect at the American Public Health Association, among many other roles. I'm an architect, businesswoman, and clean tech and climate tech investor. And here's the fun part. Natasha and I are both from Kentucky. We both work, yes. We both work in Louisville, and we're both Kentucky colonels. How cool is that? Try to find another pair of boards run by women with these credentials, and we will get you Derby tickets. Kentucky Colonel is an honorary title bestowed by the governor of Kentucky, not a military rank. Think Colonel Sanders, Muhammad Ali, George Clooney, and your board chairs. Natasha and I also love Kentucky's state motto, united we stand, divided we fall. This could not be more true for climate action. United we stand, divided we bake. So, Natasha and I do all we can to ensure CCL's success, but we can't do it without all of you. Thank you for your passion, persistence, creativity, and financial support. In case you're interested, my personal mission is to recruit and activate as many right-of-center and conservative climate advocates as soon as possible. I believe it's the fastest path for enduring climate solutions, ones that won't whipsaw back and forth with changing political winds. CCL, as the major nonpartisan grassroots climate organization, is uniquely positioned to engage millions of right-of-center climate-concerned Americans. We need everyone in this fight working toward a common goal. A thermometer isn't political, and time is running out. United, we succeed. Divided, we bake. Our next speakers would doubtless help us be more effective advocates. Thank you for all you do. Now I'll turn it over to Keston.
Please welcome Keston Bazinovich.
Okay, I'm very excited to introduce our next speakers. Nwandi Lawson draws on decades of experience as a journalist and media producer. She has a lifelong commitment to transcending differences and recognizes there are many ways to build vibrant, unified communities. We discovered Nwandi on Amanda Ripley's podcast, How To. She had great advice on communicating with family at gatherings where relatives have very different views. We posted that podcast on our forums on CCL Community last fall, and many of our CCLers loved it and found a lot of value in it. Amanda Ripley is New York Times bestselling author and an investigative journalist. Her books include High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, which is now out in paperback. Her other books include The Smartest Kids in the World and The Unthinkable. She writes for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Politico, and other outlets. And she hosts the weekly Slate podcast, How To. Amy Bennett initially found out about Amanda from long-term CCLer Debbie Chang, who pointed her towards Amanda's work with solutions journalism. We love Amanda's focus on solutions. Many of us at CCL walk away from Amanda's work feeling energized and supplied with new tools. And with that, please welcome Nwandi and Amanda to the stage. Yeah.
Wow, look at all of these people.
Oh my God, it's beautiful. Look at you. You're beautiful. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you. Well, we get a chance to sit down and
How
chat
great is
again.
this?
Isn't this
I
nice?
know.
Yeah.
I can't tell you on how many levels I've been excited for this. So I wrote half my last book in the garden of this hotel because I live near here. And it was closed for a while, as you might imagine. This huge 2,000 room hotel just empty. And that beautiful garden empty. And then there were soldiers here after January 6th. This is where many of the soldiers stayed. And every time I would walk by, it just was so heartbreaking. So to see it full of people trying to make the world a better place is incredibly, incredibly energizing and hopeful. And then to be able to talk to Nwandi, who the last time I spoke to you all, I didn't know Nwandi. So I had a lot to learn. But I wanted to maybe kick us off by asking you a little bit about your own story, and it will explain how we met and what I've learned from Nwandi. So we are both journalists, both come from different kinds of journalism, but similar national political journalism, and both have, I think it's fair to say, lots of questions about how journalism is working these days and what could be better. But so tell us a little bit about, if you don't mind, Nwandi, about your own, what it was like to be a CNN reporter in the midst of it, covering politics, and maybe how it changed over time.
I think that's it, right? So if you get a few decades of experience, as many of us in the room have in whatever we've been doing, right, you get to see things change over time. So I think like most young journalists in my early 20s, I approached it from the idea that we were going to tell the stories that help people make the good decisions, and that's really a contribution to making the world a better place. And I think that was very much true, but I also got a chance to see what was happening to the political landscape. And so I watched it shift over time, you know, from the very first election that I covered in 1992 all the way up to the present. And one of the things that I saw was just this rise of conflict. And so whereas at the earliest part of my career, I would have said, well, regardless of how I feel about the views that a person is sharing from the Senate or the House of Representatives or whatnot, I can appreciate the statesmanship. And so it was almost to me like another part of my career was also as a sports journalist. And I never went to the game to root for one team or the other, but I wished to see good play. Over time, I began to watch that somewhat unravel, and that was a bit disappointing to me. I don't know what your experience has been with that.
When did you start to really notice that? Do you
It was so gradual at times. I don't know that it was a sudden explosive moment, but I will say certainly having covered the Georgia State Legislature as it went through lots of political shifts, watching the people who were in power at the very front row of one of the chambers moving back as that was happening. And then, of course, watching people go to the podium and instead of bringing studies from the University of Chicago or a bit of, some other kinds of scientific research, just watching them kind of yell at one another and defame each other, try to describe some measure of a person's character as being unworthy of any rational, ideas or whatnot.
became more of a spectacle, maybe?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And in the middle of this, if I have this right, you encountered a faith that you had not heard about before.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's really funny. That's somewhat connected to my career as well, because in 1999, I was between two contracts. I was about to start as the senior political correspondent for Georgia Public Broadcasting, but I had a little break. So I went to Africa. I went to Cameroon, actually. And I was going to work with Cameroonian radio and television for a few months. Except when I got there, no one was really working for Cameroonian radio and television because there was kind of the government wasn't paying anyone. So instead, I got a chance to sell makeup from the television station and meet a lot of really good people. In addition, though, I also met some people who belonged to the Baha'i faith, which was something I hadn't heard about. And so I began, there was no, hard sell on this, but as we would have discussions about the things of the world or whatnot, they constantly would ask me, "Are you sure you're not a Baha'i?" And I said, "I don't know, what is that?"
Yeah.
So that's how I started learning about that, and the idea that actually there was a world religion in which the people were interested in bringing all people together, regardless of religion or race or gender and all of these kinds of things. And so that kind of struck me as interesting.
So it's like you were a Baha'i before you knew what that was.
I didn't know what it was. Yeah.
It's interesting. I had never heard of the Baha'i faith. Has anybody heard of the Baha'i faith before? Oh, what?
Oh, wow,
What?
Look at you guys.
I have literally never, outside of a Baha'i gathering, seen, that's amazing. Anyway, we'll discuss that later. But so I had never heard of it, and then I was working on this book about conflict and how people get stuck in really poisonous conflict and how they get out, right? And so I was talking to everyone I could find and asking them, do you know of any people or communities who do conflict differently? And Jennifer Brandel, who's a journalist I greatly admire, she said to me, "Have you heard of the Baha'is?" She's from Chicago. And so I started investigating this community of faith where, like you said, collective unity is the driving
It's the goal.
theme, right? Yeah. And learned that there are certain guardrails, is my understanding, you tell me, in Baha'i decision-making that would be a wonderful way to do politics, to keep the ego in check, basically, is how I understood it. But how did the Baha'i faith how did you take some of that and apply it to your work?
Well, like you said, as I began to learn about the Baha'i faith now, here I was starting my job as a senior political correspondent, and I was also learning about this religion. So I was saying, look at how they do elections. Yeah. There aren't any nominations. Nobody gets to run for office. In fact, you have to be very, very quiet about any of these things. And people are simply prayerfully selecting the 9 people in their community that they think can best, meet the needs. And they have to come to that decision because they all work together in the community. And then they made that decision. And then after that, no questions are asked. Or look at how then when you're serving on one of these elected bodies, you have to make a decision with consultation. That is, everyone's views have to come in, but once you've shared your view, it no longer belongs to you.
So it was, yeah.
So often when I use this in my work, which I do, I will just literally put a bowl in the middle of the table and I'll say, okay, as we're sharing something, let's write it down, let's put it in the middle. Once we've done that, it doesn't belong to me, the individual, it belongs to the group. I am generously sharing this. What happens next, I'm not going to try to control.
Right, so you release your grip on the idea
exactly.
a little bit, right?
Yeah. And then if we find ourselves being really attached to it, we joke sometimes in my workplace, I say, why don't we go ahead and take that back out? I don't think we're ready to contribute that yet to the group. We're holding it as our...
That's for me, right?
Yeah.
That's funny. This idea of not having, so once you propose normally, you propose an idea, you remember these story meetings we would go to, right? I remember when I was at Time Magazine, these story meetings were just there were so many layers of emotion, none of which were ever verbalized. But you would pitch your idea and then your ego was very attached to how the editors would react and what would, and then you kind of stop really thinking about, is it a good idea? Because
you have to push
your whole
that
value
idea.
In the world depends on. So I love that as a ritual. So tell us a little bit about how over time you've shifted a little bit what you do, and tell us what you do now, and how it relates to the problem of trying to get people to work on hard problems together across big divides.
Which is isn't that the question of our day right now, right? How do we work together on really, really big problems? Not with this sense of, like this fictional, let's just hold hands and we all get along. No, actually we have differing views, and how do we give value to that instead of kind of defaming it? And so, one thing for me, and maybe we can look at one of the slides that we have here, just to kind of show, how it is that we can consider these things, that we have to look for a point of unity. I'm not really sure from where I am now. I think I'm going, am I at the, I don't see it on the confidence monitor.
We can't see anything on the confidence monitor, but we're just gonna have confidence.
We will. So essentially though, I think, one of the things that I drew from the Baha'i faith is the idea that we have to look for this point of unity. So in everything, there is somewhere that I can actually look at this. You guys are smiling at me, meaning I'm probably not at a point of unity, am I? Am I?
Yeah,
okay.
You're good.
All right.
Wait.
Am I a point?
Back it up.
There we go. Brava.
Yay.
Thank you. Well, so we're looking for this point of unity in all the things that we do. And sometimes, of course, as you all know, all of the differences we have are really described, and then we don't actually get a chance to look for what is that really precious point. And so, we spend all of our time kind of arguing about these things. So one of the things that I get to bring to the work that I do now, working with different organizations and schools and other groups that are trying to learn about this, is to really try to help ourselves to ask some good questions, to try to figure out for ourselves, for instance, what exactly is our aspiration as an organization or as a community? And then also, what is the aspiration of those that we would like to collaborate with? And by the way, very intentionally looking at collaborators and seeing everyone as a potential collaborator, even those that today don't appear to have the same views we do. And then, of course, trying to figure out where do these points meet? Because there has to be some place. We're human beings, and we know that our DNA is almost identical. Our atoms are constantly, reverberating against one another. So really, the degree of individuality that we have is quite small.
Right.
In fact, there's a lot more points that we have in common than not.
I always notice that the most when I leave the country. Like all of a sudden I become very, American. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, where as soon as I leave, I'm like an ambassador for 300 million people that I've never met, and I can tell you all about them. It is, but that distance makes you realize that actually Americans have a lot in common, and humans have a lot in common. You had a story you told me recently. I wondered if you could share it here about a board that you were on, and there was some division.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been there. It's like coming up on my 30th anniversary of being in that area. But in any case, I served for many years on the board of the Interfaith Children's Movement. So these are child advocates. Some are Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, Wicca, all different kinds of traditions coming together. And the common aim is to make life better for children. And so they were moving along at doing their work and feeling relatively successful, I think, in it. And then one year, the state of Georgia began to see political shifts. And so for the first time since Reconstruction, the Republican Party began to elect first a large number of legislators and then later the governors. Well, I came in the time that the first governor, the Republican governor, was elected. I came into a board meeting, and it really did appear that someone had died. No one was greeting each other warmly. They were just sitting in the meeting, looking sad. So, okay, well, what happened? Well, our cause is lost now. We've lost. So now, mind you, like yourselves, this is a nonpartisan organization. So there would be no donations to a political party and so forth. So we had to, as an organization, either fold or figure out what are the points of unity that we have. And we could come to the common conclusion that Democrats and Republicans love children. They give birth to them, they raise them.
This is a radical statement. Part of me wants to disagree, but it doesn't seem right.
Now, we could look at all the ways that perhaps in different families or whatnot, we might choose to raise them differently. Our values and standards might differ somewhat. But in the end, we want to see our children do well. So as a result of kind of coming to that, they were able to see certain realities, like the new governor and his wife had served as foster parents. Let's talk about that. And they were able to help so that the rate that foster parents are paid was doubled during that time in office. We were able to look at the fact that the senator who was leading the Health and Human Services Committee was also a pediatric nurse. She loves children. We were able to look at how can we increase the health care benefits for low-income children. So, things like that really enabled us not only to be able to say, well, we can continue to exist in this environment, but rather we can thrive in this environment when we find those points of unity.
Right, and it's not that you therefore agree or that you give up on your other, right. It's interesting because I think the word unity has sort of needs a rebranding, right? Like it's gotten sort of a bad rep. So it doesn't mean, what I've come to realize is it doesn't mean agreement necessarily, right? It's so an example that comes to mind from my own reporting is wolves. Wolves are very divisive in much of the world. I don't know if you're aware of this, but probably some of you are. Probably some of you are from places where wolves are divisive. So in Denmark, so there hadn't been wolves in Western Europe for like 100 years, and they started coming back. And some people saw this as a wonderful sign of the healing of the earth. It's more natural and wild. And some people saw this as a predator that was harming their livestock and competing with hunters for big game, and generally kind of scary. So there were very different reactions. Over time, it's become very polarized in certain countries. And there was one example of a place in Denmark, pretty remote area where that was where most of the wolves were. And so this community organizer and researchers came together and brought the whole community together. And they did a bunch of things over time to try to understand how to move forward over this divisive issue. But one of the things that I always remember is they started off the first meetings. They all came to this town center. They had dinner, which was smart. It's always good to have food if you can. And then before they got going, the organizer just very, matter-of-factly stated that they all had two things in common. And they all looked at each other because they felt like they had very little in common. And he said, we all share the air that we breathe and the future. And no one could disagree. So sometimes that's a way to prime a conversation to go forward and have profound disagreement in a way that acknowledges your common humanity.
That's so significant, isn't it? Because a lot of what we do is to shame and call each other out now, which completely
is the opposite.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was telling you earlier, I have appreciated in your work is you've done a lot of excellent research. I had certain intuitions just watching people in the world that perhaps as social media in particular grew up and calling out became a culture, and it became, particularly in many social justice movements, it was like the merit that you could, really, but then to really see that doing that to people as opposed to what you describe in Denmark, which is calling them all in.
Yeah.
We are all humans. We all have certain things that we have in common, a lot of these things, and we want to see each other succeed.
Yeah, it's funny how it feels, so your intuition is not to call people out, but I think for many of us, the intuition is, speaking for myself, that somehow calling people out will be persuasive, right? So it's funny how wrong the intuition is, and the research is very clear that that's not how persuasion happens. But I sometimes am curious about why that is, and I suspect that part of it is evolutionarily we came up in sort of small groups, right? So you could actually leverage some amount of pressure or maybe even a little bit of shame because the person was in your group. But if you try to shame someone who doesn't feel like they're in your group, it actually makes them dig in, right? So it's a sort of like an adaptation or an evolutionary instinct that hasn't quite evolved for a diverse, large, interdependent world. But yeah, that is something I have radically changed on. I don't engage that way on social media anymore because it's just, and I actually much prefer how it feels.
Well, what's interesting is, like you said, evolutionarily, if we're going to stay in small clans, you're right, it actually absolutely makes sense. I need to push you out. We're keeping our resources over here. You guys go over there and do, you're hunting on those grounds. But now, as you mentioned, we're in a completely different landscape. So then how do we begin to use our large prefrontal cortex so that we can advance? And one of the things, this in your book, In High Conflict, you point out that like this shaming or calling out, it really does have, ramifications. And I recently worked with a group of middle schoolers who, unfortunately, but something that happens quite a lot, they drummed a member of their group out because the person made a politically unwise statement, if you will, for that group. And the students, although they're too young to actually have any political persuasion, they are part of families, so little clans and groups. And so they naturally believed that the correct response was to call this person out.
That was a way of showing allegiance. And right.
So naturally, one of the good pieces of news is that their school didn't let them just move on like that. They did actually drum the person out. The child and family left the school, left the community. This is very sad. However, I do commend the school for at least saying, let's try to do something. And so one of the things that we used was, from this section of high conflict. And so we can see that, shaming or calling someone out, it feels good temporarily.
Right, you feel
right?
very good about yourself. Temporarily.
For a minute. But the next thing that we looked at was the fact that it actually takes a physical toll on you. So this is an actual experiment that was run, and it kind of shows a couple of minutes here of how people, what is happening to our bodies when we exclude people. Do you guys have to actually press play from there? I'm not sure, it's not. No.
Yeah, we know that in the brain lights up from just a small amount of exclusion. It lights up in the same way it lights up when you give someone an electrical shock. So it's sometimes called social pain. And so it's literally a feeling that is very primal, and we want it to end.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That feeling.
Absolutely. Well, it's okay. We won't. You basically summed up the experiment there. Basically, they have people in an MRI, and they are at first playing this very simple game, right, where they're throwing a ball, and all three players, they believe that other people are in an MRI playing with them on this video game, and they're throwing the ball, and then at some point, the experimenters take the person who is the subject out of the game. So they begin throwing just between each other. then the actual pain center of the brain is activated and the person is in physical pain because of the exclusion. And what's really interesting is they can relieve the pain by giving them a pain reliever, ibuprofen.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the pain center goes down. So one of the things, and certainly working with young people, is reminding them that we would never walk up to someone and just punch them because we know that that would hurt. And we know about the physical pain that would ensue. But actually shaming and calling out has a lot of the same factors and so forth.
Yeah, and it explains a lot. Like I would ask you the next time someone that you are trying to negotiate with or sort of deal with across any kind of divide, if they start acting in ways that doesn't seem to make sense, maybe it seems like it's against their interest. I was talking to a politician the other day who was telling me that this recently happened across the aisle where she felt like the other side was just refusing to come to the table on something that they actually agreed on, which is a classic sign of high conflict. And she started thinking, I wonder if there's humiliation going on here underneath. And in fact, the woman in question across the aisle, her counterpart, had felt disrespected at some point. Often politics these days is personal. So I would argue that way more often it is personal and way less often it is purely political or about policy. And so she took her out to lunch. They talked about it. She made her feel sort of heard and tried to restore some of that respect. And they came to the table, did the deal, it was done. But it was the kind of thing where, had she not been looking for humiliation, they would have just gotten stuck there, right? Because it didn't make sense. Now, the tricky thing is humiliation's in the eye of the beholder, right? Like,
True.
So something that might humiliate me might
Exactly.
not bother you, but it is. And sometimes Nelson Mandela has a great quote about this where he says, there is no one more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly.
Wow.
I love that last little addendum. And it took him a long time to come to that, right? Like it's not like he overnight, but he started to see that as everyone I've known who's shifted out of high conflict, they start to see that humiliation supersizes conflict.
Absolutely.
So you can do it, but just know that.
Yeah. Well, so one way that we've been looking at how in the organization that I run is, how does language actually help us to shift out of that, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm focused on commending people more than I'm focused on, criticizing or tearing them down, what impact does that have on how much further we can go? Because in the end, we want to advance. And so this idea of learning a new language and saying, okay, you know what? First and foremost, while I'm looking for those points of unity, I'm also looking for what is commendable in what you are doing. I do not believe that many of us are absolutely without any merit. We have certain things that we disagree about. And so we want to be able to say, what can I identify as like these virtues or gifts of character? And how can I actually speak to those to let the other collaborator, potential collaborator know, I appreciate you, I do respect you.
Yeah.
And I can see these things in you and I want to really draw on those. And so commending frequently. And then the idea also of asking these what and how questions. Because when you ask someone why, they're just automatically defensive.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, it doesn't maybe make rational sense. But if I say to you, Amanda, why did you wear that shirt?
Exactly.
It's one response. If I say, Amanda, what is it that you like about that shade, and it looks really good with your hair, and then we're having a different conversation and I still get, information. So really, kind of training ourselves to do those things. And of course, that last bullet point there, sincerity does count. So the idea of buttering people up, they're on to us.
People know that. Yeah. It's so interesting that you bring this up because I recently met a professional interrogator named Dale Reeves. So interesting. He used to work at the FBI and now he spent many years working for companies where they bring him in when someone is stealing from the company. But they don't have enough evidence and they need a confession, basically. So this is a little different than like the ideal.
Right.
But if you think about it, it's sort of like a journalist interviewee. It's a very adversarial conversation, right? It's not.
Could be.
More adversarial even. So he goes and talks to people who they're pretty sure are stealing from the company. And literally the whole thing is the opposite of what my intuition would be. He does not use coercion. He doesn't try to relate to the person. He doesn't try to say, oh, you grew up, literally if the person went to the same high school he did, he doesn't say anything. Because that takes the spotlight off of them and puts it back on him, right? So he was really trying to connect with them, and what he puts it this way, it's sort of slightly different, but I think the same idea. He says, I try to create them as an extraordinary person. They probably are extraordinary. Can I find out in what way? And if not, can I create that? Can I see the virtues and values that they have, that they probably maybe have broken with in this
stealing from the company.
And again, when he does this, people will confess, get arrested, and thank him for seeing them in a way that they want to be seen and reminding them of who they really are, right? So it's kind of an extreme case, but I like it because this all sounds very nice and kind of soft and woo-woo, but in fact there's just a ton of research behind it that even in very adversarial encounters, everyone believes they are a moral agent for good.
Yeah.
And so can we see each other that way, even as we disagree? And it helps us understand what seems inexplicable on the surface, right?
You know, what I found interesting too is that commendation is such a great tool, and that it's very necessary, particularly the more intimate the relations grow, right? So if you're in a workplace setting, for instance, generally before someone can receive a correction, they would have had to receive 5 commendations. So to believe that you actually have any interest in me advancing, if you're my manager or something, say, I would have had to hear you at least 5 times say something positive about what I did.
It's like parenting.
Exactly. Well, you know what gets good is when you're in an intimate relationship, the number goes up to 7. So before my child can hear me, I have to think of 7 wonderful things, and it's very interesting because often the intuition is the opposite again. Right? I told you to take the trash out. You know? It's like, but how frequently have you admired the fact that I was committed to my football squad, or that all these other things that I've been doing, and now you're just calling me out for not taking the trash out.
Right. No, that ratio, I think it's sometimes called the magic ratio, right? Of positive interactions for it's a way to build conflict resilience in a relationship, right? To have, which is why I think it's been especially hard with the pandemic, right? Because you're much less likely to have those fleeting positive interactions where you just notice someone or see someone or ask about their child or their sick mother, or those things. Even if it's not a commendation per se, it's a way of connecting as a human.
At a very positive level, right?
Right. And it's important for it to be genuine. Although I was just talking to someone who works with high conflict people at a place called the High Conflict Institute. So this is kind of way out on the extreme, but he was arguing that you can actually in some cases fake it till you make it, which I don't know.
No, honestly, I actually think you have to, because all of these things, when someone first approached me with this idea of speaking this language of the virtues, it sounded outlandish to me.
Yeah, right.
I'm a journalist. I ask the hard-hitting questions. I do not tell people that they're being honest. I tell you you're a liar. I had to practice a lot.
Well, it's like learning another language. I think that's a good analogy.
Yes.
Like when I first started speaking French, it did not feel natural.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have one more thing we want to share, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So please do, if you haven't already shared your questions, I think they're collecting index cards, and we'd love to hear from you and make this more interactive. So
absolutely.
What's the last thing we wanted to share?
So just to celebrate these small achievements. Sometimes when we're trying to make a mighty effort, as all of you are, towards a really big change, we sometimes overlook the fact that we're actually making progress. And so we have to take a moment to reflect and say, okay, we did not resolve the entire issue, but we've taken these simple steps forward. So for us, we try to use this cycle of learning to kind of reflect and gather these things as we go. We say, okay, well, we're going to study the problem so that we can all speak with articulation to it and so forth. We're going to consult together and decide what course of action we will take. Then we'll act on it. Then we'll reflect on that action. And then we'll be able to measure, did we make progress? Sometimes actually we rolled back. There were some countervailing forces. We have to measure that too. But sometimes we are making small steps forward. And I think when people like yourselves who are full of idealism and you're very committed, just recognizing that change happens over generations, right? And so we have to really appreciate how it is happening and to celebrate those small times that we do take a few steps forward.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot lately about how journalism kind of robs people of hope and agency, and how much we know that people need hope and agency, or else you're just kind of stuck, right? Like if you think about the coverage of the mass shootings recently, right? I don't know about you, but I just feel like marinating in sadness and despair has actually gotten to a point where it's paralyzing, right? Like I'm not doing anything with this information because it feels hopeless. Yeah. So all around the world, for many hundreds of years, extremists feed on hopelessness, right? Like that is how you seed the arena to extremists, because it feels impossible. I think there's just very quickly something I wanted to share, that the Solutions Journalism Network did some research with Smith Geiger, which is a big media research company, where they did side by side. They had audiences watch a short TV news segment about a problem, which is the sort of traditional way to cover something, and then they had them watch the same length segment, very short, about a community trying, and maybe failing, maybe succeeding, to work on that problem, right? And what they found is the engagement was like twice as high with the solutions, which I don't know would have been true 15 years ago, but I think people are so desperate for some foothold, right? And so that's actually huge. The other thing that was interesting is it was true for all political affiliations. It was true across race, age, gender, and the engagement was such that you could watch a longer segment, which is a big deal in TV news, and people would watch it about a different town, whereas the problem story, they only wanted it to be, they wouldn't watch it if it wasn't about their town, unless it was really over the top extreme. So anyway, there's a lot of implications for journalism there, but I wonder if also there are implications for the work that you do when it comes to giving people, not false hope, obviously, right? But even a sense that, like, there is rigorous reporting and storytelling to be done about communities trying to solve climate change, even when they don't succeed, even when the progress is incremental. That is interesting and lights up sort of a different part of our brain, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I think, do you want to open it up?
Yeah, maybe we can hear from you all.
Yeah. I think we're going to have somebody, we've got a question right up front here.
We've got questions in the back, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant just an index card, and then they're going to read, I believe we're going to read the questions in the back.
Yes, so we have time for one question, sadly. We have loved hearing from you. But we actually had several questions on this theme, so I'll ask this one. Is there a distinction between calling out or shaming versus speaking truth to power?
So before we answer that, can I just say we'd love to still get the questions and respond in some way that you all think is manageable, because, thank you. You want to take
I think so. I mean, I absolutely do not believe that using any of the techniques that we have described is passive. It's actually a means by which so-called power can actually receive what is true. So that means, for instance, not just showing up and spewing lots of facts at a person, because actually we all have access to the same facts. We have the internet. And so if, in fact, just the quest for facts was there, we would all, go and get them and whatnot. Actually, the quest is for understanding and the ability of parties to speak one to another. So I don't think that there's anything that keeps us from being able to speak to power. And in fact, that's what, a lot of the work that I get a chance to do is how do communities actually contribute to change? But they don't get very far when their only technique is to continually just call out, shame, blame, or criticize, who the other side, but rather to draw them in, come into conversation and ultimately into relationship so that we can figure out what are the points of unity that we have moving forward. But I acknowledge that it is a little bit unorthodox and that it does require practice. And it requires a community, because I don't think individuals fare very well as one person trying this alone, because the darts are going to fly back at you from those who are not familiar with these particular strategies. And I think left alone, we become very despondent in that case.
Yeah, no, so it's interesting, right? Because we all have access to the same information, but we don't have trust in the same information. So the problem isn't argument, a lack of argument or information. It's a lack of relationship and trust, which is a deeper problem, right? I feel like we have time for one more. I mean, I'm ahead of my time. I don't know about you all, but one more?
Well, we have collected all the question cards back here, so we will give them to you afterward, but we are at time, sadly.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you all very much. Really appreciate being with you tonight.
Please welcome Mark Reynolds.
Planning that session for over a year, and I've been really excited. I couldn't wait for it. I've been telling everybody this is a session you had to attend. And I think that what we learned is we're going to have to kick our game up to another level. And that's not a bad thing for this organization. So thank you both so much. That was fantastic. I love one of the things Nwandi said also about how you have to give people 5 compliments before you can criticize them. I got a note from a group leader 3 years ago who said, because I've always said positive things about you, I think I should be able to criticize you at certain moments. And she said, you oftentimes say I when you should say me. And I'm like, okay, I'll go to work on my pronouns. So many of you give so much of your time to this organization, and all of us, I don't mean like I'm grateful for it, everybody's grateful for everybody else being able to give so much of your time. Some of you are also able to donate financially, and it allows us to do certain things like this conference. We cannot put this conference on without your donations. We can't make that whole reconciliation push without your donations. You know, we have 3 organizations. We have CCE, CCL, and CCI. CCI does the work with our 134 chapters in 76 countries. They also work a lot on the UN process. And 2 weeks ago, they launched a new program. There are a lot of countries that cannot field UN delegations. They don't have the scientific wherewithal. They don't have the ability to show people how to negotiate the UN process. And so they hire people from other countries. So what our CCI did in connection with Fletcher School of Management at Tufts University is created a training program and launched it 2 weeks ago. So now we can train countries that before could not represent themselves at the UN, at the COP meetings. They can now do it. And we can only do that because of your donations. Thank you. I wanted to invite a couple of my colleagues up who are from our development department. This is Perry Hodgkins-Jones, who has a delightful 3-year-old daughter. And this is Topher Anderson, who has a delightful 3-month-old son. We wanted to talk about climate guardians with you for a moment. Those are people who are able to donate more than $10,000 a year. And first of all, I wanted to ask my colleagues to talk about how having very young children impacts your work. So Perry.
Hi. So this is my daughter, Alice. She is 3. And we spend most of our time together just exploring the world and learning from each other. She has always been a very verbal child. And recently, she asks us a lot of questions. They're mostly small questions that we can answer for her or help her come to her own conclusions, like, why do skinks lose their tails? But as she gets bigger, I want to be able to answer her bigger questions. When she's older, I know she's going to ask, what did you do to turn around the climate crisis while we still could? Were you a part of that movement? What did you do to change our economy and strengthen our democracy? And that's a big reason why I do this work and why I love my job. I will do whatever it takes to bring more people into this mission and strengthen this movement, because I know that we are at a historic moment together for passing the critical policies that we need to build a livable world for her, for me, for y'all. And I know that it's because I not only want that, a better future and a better world for her, but because I believe in it. And this is Topher.
All right, so I just like sharing whoa, that's loud. Better? Okay, I just like sharing this story because I remember I learned about my little 2-year-old Marshall there, or oh my gosh, 3-month-old Marshall there, on a Tuesday. And that Friday, the Growing Climate Solutions Act passed the Senate on a vote of 92-8. And it was that day that my wife found me just happy sobbing at my desk. She thought something was wrong. But what had really happened is it had just hit me that all of the work I've ever done on this, that I'll ever do, is for the little guy I hadn't even met yet. Every climate victory is building him a better future. So he's now 3 months old, and you can see he is the cutest baby that's ever been born. But I know in 2050 he'll be almost my age, and hopefully he'll have an adorable young child like this. And in 2100, hopefully he'll be a grandparent. And so these climate reference goals of 2050 and 2100 that we always discuss, that's what they are to me now. And I just feel such a sense of urgency for that, and so much gratitude to all of you that together we've built this vehicle where I can actually build that for him, a livable world and a better future.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. So our next session starts at 10:20. If you could be back in time for that. If you could consider being a climate guardian, or you know people who might be able to consider being climate guardians, if you wouldn't mind coming to see us during this next break, or find us during sometime during the conference. One of the things the climate guardians do is they do things like being able to build those matching pools, so that someone like me who can't give at $10,000, I can stretch myself just a little bit. So again, we'll start at 10:20. If you'd like to talk to us about possibly being a climate guardian, donating the $10,000 level, please come see us now or at any time during the conference. Thank you all so much.